"You're just a poster girl," my daughter-in-law said, loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. A few people laughed politely. A few looked away. Most simply smiled the way people do when they think someone else has already decided who matters in the room. I smiled too. Then I took my seat. At that moment, not one person in that ballroom knew who I really was. The Crystal Harbor Ballroom in downtown Boston glittered beneath dozens of chandeliers. White tablecloths stretched across the room like fresh snow. Waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying silver trays and glasses of sparkling water. It was the annual Hope Horizons Gala, the biggest fundraising event of the year for the organization that had become a household name across New England. My daughter-in-law, Madison Reed, stood near the stage wearing a designer gown that probably cost more than my first car. At 38, she was confident, ambitious, and very good at controlling a room. My son Daniel stood beside her, adjusting his cufflinks and smiling at donors. He looked successful, respected, important. As I watched him from across the ballroom, I wondered when he had learned to avoid looking directly at me. Madison walked over just as I reached the VIP section. She glanced at my navy blue dress, then at the old pearl earrings I always wore. "There you are," she said with a bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. "The photographers may want a few pictures later." I nodded politely. Then she leaned slightly closer and laughed. "You're just a poster girl, Eleanor. Don't worry about all the board business." The people around her chuckled. One man nearly spilled his drink, trying not to laugh too loudly. I simply thanked her and sat down. The name card in front of me read, "Campaign Guest." I stared at it for a moment. Campaign guest. Not founder. Not trustee. Not benefactor. Just guest. Across the room, a massive banner displayed a photograph taken nearly 20 years ago. There I was, smiling beside a group of scholarship recipients. Underneath the image were the words, "The Face of Hope." Nothing more. No mention of the years. No mention of the sacrifices. No mention of Henry. My late husband's name was nowhere to be found. I folded my hands neatly in my lap. Around me, conversations flowed. People discussed investments, expansion plans, media campaigns, and future branding opportunities. No one asked for my opinion. No one introduced themselves. More than once, I heard someone refer to me as the woman from the old advertisements. I should have felt angry. Instead, I felt something colder, something quieter. Because while everyone in that ballroom believed they understood exactly who I was, they had no idea they were sitting inside a story that began long before any of them arrived. And before the night was over, the room was going to learn a lesson that no marketing campaign could ever teach. I sat at that table for nearly 20 minutes before the first course arrived. Around me, conversations rose and fell like gentle waves. People laughed at stories about investment portfolios, vacation homes on Cape Cod, and children attending prestigious universities. Crystal glasses chimed softly whenever someone offered a toast. Everything looked elegant. Everything looked successful. Yet I felt strangely invisible. Not because I was alone. I had learned how to be alone years ago. What unsettled me was how easily people accepted the version of me they had been given. A smiling face on a brochure. A pleasant elderly woman who represented a good cause. Nothing more. I reached for the water glass in front of me and glanced toward the stage. Massive screens displayed photographs from the organization's history. Children receiving scholarships. Families attending community programs. Volunteers planting gardens. The audience smiled warmly whenever another image appeared. Then I noticed something. Every photograph from the early years had been carefully edited. Names removed. Captions shortened. Stories simplified. History polished into marketing material. My eyes lingered on one photograph longer than the others. A younger version of myself stood beside Henry. We were both smiling despite looking exhausted. That picture had been taken 32 years earlier. We had spent the entire weekend assembling folding tables for a fundraising event because we could not afford professional equipment. Henry had driven a borrowed pickup truck more than 80 miles each way to collect donated supplies. Looking at that image now, no one in the room would have guessed what it had cost us to build those early programs. A young woman seated nearby leaned toward me. "You must be proud," she said politely. "Your picture is everywhere." I smiled. "It has been a long journey." She nodded without asking another question. To her, that answer was enough. Across the ballroom, Madison moved confidently between tables. She shook hands with donors, posed for photographs, and spoke with reporters. Every movement looked practiced. Every smile looked carefully measured. People admired her. I could see why. She understood appearances. She understood influence. She understood how to make a story attractive. What she did not understand was the difference between creating an image and earning a legacy. Daniel finally glanced in my direction. For a brief moment, our eyes met. I saw hesitation there, perhaps even discomfort. But the moment passed quickly. Madison touched his arm, said something I could not hear, and he immediately looked away. The old ache settled quietly in my chest. Not anger, not resentment, just disappointment. I remembered the little boy who used to sit beside Henry in our garage workshop, asking endless questions about every project we built together. Back then, Daniel understood where things came from. He understood effort. Somewhere along the way, that understanding had faded. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as preparations for the evening program began. Guests returned to their seats. Conversations softened. On the large screen, a new presentation appeared beneath the words "Building Tomorrow." The audience applauded. I folded my hands and watched carefully, because for the first time that evening, I had the feeling that something much more important than a fundraising gala was about to begin. The presentation began with all the polish and confidence that money could buy. Professional narration filled the ballroom. Carefully edited videos appeared across the giant screens. Donors smiled as statistics flashed across the stage. Scholarship numbers, community outreach programs, expansion goals. Every achievement was presented with the precision of a corporate annual report. The audience applauded at all the right moments. I applauded too. Yet the longer I watched, the more something felt wrong. It was not what appeared on the screen. It was what did not. Entire chapters of the organization had vanished. Names disappeared. Stories simplified. Sacrifices reduced to bullet points. The past had been compressed into a neat marketing package. During a short break between presentations, I stood and quietly made my way toward the side corridor beside the ballroom. I needed a few minutes away from the noise. The hallway was lined with framed photographs from previous galas. Decades of smiling faces stared back at me. Governors, business leaders, scholarship recipients, volunteers. I stopped in front of one frame and studied it carefully. It showed a fundraising dinner from 28 years ago. Henry stood at the center of the picture wearing the same dark suit he had worn to church every Sunday. His smile looked tired but proud. I reached out and gently touched the edge of the frame. Someone had replaced the original caption. The old plaque used to list the names of everyone involved in organizing that event. Now it simply read, "Early community supporters." Supporters. I almost laughed. Henry had mortgaged part of our future to keep that event alive. We had spent months planning it. We had personally called hundreds of people. We had folded invitations at our kitchen table until midnight. Supporters. The word felt strangely hollow. I thought I would find you here. The voice startled me. I turned and saw Grace Miller approaching slowly from the far end of the hallway. Time had silvered her hair just as it had mine, but her eyes remained sharp. For nearly 25 years, she had served as executive assistant to 3 different board chairs. There was very little she did not know about this organization. "Grace," I said warmly, "it has been too long." She smiled and embraced me. For a moment, we simply stood there, 2 women looking at photographs that represented half a lifetime. Then her expression changed. The warmth faded slightly. Concern took its place. "Eleanor," she said quietly, "there is something you need to know." A familiar feeling settled into my stomach. Not fear. Recognition. The feeling that arrives when pieces of a puzzle begin fitting together. Grace glanced down the hallway to make certain we were alone. "The board meeting tomorrow morning is not what they told you it is." I remained silent. "Madison has been pushing a proposal for months," she continued. "Most people assume it is routine restructuring. It is not." The sounds of applause drifted faintly from the ballroom. Grace lowered her voice even further. "She wants to remove several founding provisions from the charter. She wants complete control over branding, communications, and future fundraising partnerships." I looked back toward the ballroom doors. "And what does that have to do with me?" Grace hesitated. The pause told me everything before she even spoke. "Your name is one of the provisions she wants removed." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The sounds from the ballroom felt distant now, as though they belonged to another building entirely. I looked once more at the photograph hanging on the wall. Henry's smile seemed frozen in time, untouched by the years that followed. "My name," I repeated quietly. Grace nodded. Madison believes the organization needs a more modern identity. She has convinced several newer board members that founders create limitations. She says institutions should belong to the future, not the past. I almost smiled at that. The future. People often spoke about the future as if it appeared by magic. They rarely acknowledged the people who sacrificed to create it. Grace folded her hands together. Many of them do not know the full history. They arrived long after the difficult years. They only know the polished version. Her words stirred memories I had not visited in a long time. I remembered the winter after Claire died. The house had become unbearably quiet. Henry and I had searched for some way to keep moving forward. Some reason to get out of bed each morning. One evening we sat at our kitchen table, surrounded by unpaid bills and half-finished coffee. Henry looked at me and said that if we could not change what happened to our daughter, perhaps we could help another family avoid the same heartbreak. That simple conversation became the beginning of everything. We started with one scholarship. Just one. The first fundraising dinner was held in a church basement. We borrowed folding chairs. Friends donated homemade desserts. Henry spent weekends driving across Massachusetts asking local businesses for support. Some donated $25. Others donated $50. We thanked every single one of them. There were nights when we wondered if the effort was worth it. There were months when our own savings account grew smaller because we refused to let a program fail. Yet somehow the mission survived. Then it grew. Then it expanded beyond anything we had imagined. Eleanor, Grace said gently. I returned to the present. Sorry, I said. I was remembering. She smiled sadly. I know. We began walking slowly toward the ballroom entrance. Before we reached the doors, Grace stopped again. There is something else. The concern in her voice deepened. Madison has been presenting your story to donors. She talks about resilience and community. She uses photographs of you and Henry in almost every campaign. I looked at her. But she wants my name removed from the charter. Grace nodded. That is what troubles me. The contradiction hung between us. Use the story. Remove the storyteller. Use the legacy. Remove the people who built it. For the first time that evening, a pattern became visible. Not a misunderstanding. Not an accident. A strategy. Through the ballroom doors, I could see Madison standing beneath the stage lights, speaking with several major donors. She laughed confidently at something one of them said. Daniel stood nearby listening. As I watched them, I realized something that surprised me. I was no longer hurt. Hurt comes from disappointment. This feeling was different. It was clarity. And clarity can be far more powerful than anger. Grace reached into her handbag and removed a thick manila envelope that looked as though it had been carried for years. The edges were worn. Several colored tabs protruded from the side. She held it carefully for a moment before placing it into my hands. I have been waiting a long time to decide whether to give this to you, she said. I looked down at the envelope. My name was written across the front in Henry's unmistakable handwriting. Even after all these years, I would have recognized it anywhere. My fingers froze against the paper. Where did you get this? I asked quietly. Henry left it with the board attorney 20 years ago, Grace replied. The instructions were very specific. It was only to be released if the organization ever drifted away from its original purpose. The hallway suddenly felt very still. I carefully opened the envelope and removed several documents. The first page contained the original charter. The second contained amendments added over the years. Then I reached a signed provision that I had not seen in decades. As I read the words, memories returned with startling clarity. Henry and I had insisted on that clause after the organization expanded beyond what we could personally oversee. We wanted future leaders to have freedom, but we also wanted safeguards. The provision granted one person permanent authority to intervene if the mission became secondary to image, profit, or personal ambition. That authority belonged to me. I read the page twice before looking up. Grace watched silently. Most of the current board members have never seen this document, she said. Madison certainly has not. I slipped the papers back into the envelope. Through the ballroom doors, I could hear another round of applause. The evening program was continuing without interruption. Donors smiled. Cameras flashed. Reporters took notes. The machine kept moving, unaware that a very important piece of its history had just resurfaced. Does Daniel know? I finally asked. Grace hesitated. I do not know, but I know he signed support for the restructuring proposal. The answer hurt more than I expected, not because he disagreed with me, People are allowed to disagree. What hurt was the realization that he had never come to ask questions. He had never sat across from me at my kitchen table and said, "Tell me how this began. Tell me what Dad believed. Tell me what matters." He had accepted someone else's version of the story. We stood in silence for several moments. Then Grace glanced toward the ballroom and lowered her voice. "There is one more thing. Tomorrow morning they plan to announce a strategic partnership. Madison has spent nearly a year negotiating it." "What kind of partnership?" I asked. Grace gave a small, uneasy smile. "The kind that would place her private consulting company at the center of nearly every future decision." I nodded slowly. Now the pieces fit together. The missing names, the rewritten history, the effort to remove founding protections, the attempt to reduce me to a smiling photograph. None of it was random. None of it was accidental. It was a carefully constructed path leading to a destination only a few people could see. I looked through the glass doors again. Madison stood beneath the lights, speaking confidently to a circle of influential donors. She looked completely certain of herself, completely certain that the story belonged to her now. For the first time that evening, I felt calm. Not because the situation was improving, because I finally understood it. The remainder of the evening unfolded with a strange sense of inevitability. Once you understand the shape of a problem, you stop wasting energy trying to explain it away. I returned to the ballroom, carrying the envelope beneath my arm. No one noticed. Why would they? To most people in that room, I was still the pleasant older woman from the brochures. A familiar face. A harmless symbol. The program resumed with another series of presentations. New partnerships were celebrated. Future initiatives were announced. Every few minutes the audience applauded. I watched quietly and listened carefully. It is remarkable what people reveal when they assume you have no authority. Shortly before dessert was served, I excused myself and walked toward a side hallway near the stage. I had no destination in mind. Years of fundraising events had taught me that important conversations rarely happened in front of microphones. As I rounded a corner, familiar voices drifted from a partially open conference room door. I recognized Madison immediately. "The transition will be easier than most people think," she said confidently. "People connect with stories, not structures. Once the announcement is made, nobody will care about old governance language." Several people laughed softly. Another voice asked, "What about the founder provisions?" Madison answered without hesitation. "They are outdated. We need flexibility. We cannot let emotional attachments slow growth." Emotional attachments. I stood motionless beside the hallway wall. Another board member spoke. "And Eleanor?" There was a brief pause. Then Madison replied, "Eleanor is valuable as a face. Everyone loves her story, but a story is not leadership." More agreement followed. Someone mentioned branding opportunities. Someone else discussed donor engagement. My name surfaced several more times, each mention sounding less like a person and more like a marketing asset. Then I heard Daniel speak. His voice was calm, professional. "We just need to manage the optics carefully. Nothing else. No objection. No defense. Just a sentence about optics." I closed my eyes for a moment. Oddly enough, that was the part that hurt. Not Madison's ambition. Ambitious people have always existed. Not the board's ignorance. Ignorance can be corrected. It was hearing my own son discuss my place in the organization as though I were a public relations challenge instead of his mother. Yet even then, anger never arrived. Only clarity. The conversation continued for several minutes. They discussed contracts, announcements, consulting arrangements, and strategic messaging. Every detail confirmed what Grace had already suspected. The organization was being treated less like a mission and more like an opportunity. Eventually, footsteps approached the doorway. I moved away before anyone saw me and returned to the ballroom. The dessert plates had arrived. Guests chatted happily beneath the chandeliers. Madison soon reappeared near the stage looking completely at ease. Daniel followed close behind. Neither of them realized I had heard a single word. I sat down and unfolded my napkin across my lap. Then I looked toward the stage where tomorrow's plans were already taking shape in their minds. For the first time all evening, I knew exactly what Henry would have wanted me to do. And for the first time all evening, I was ready. The gala finally came to an end just after 10 o'clock that evening. Guests collected their coats, exchanged business cards, and lingered beneath the chandeliers discussing opportunities and future plans. I remained seated long after many tables had emptied. From where I sat, I could see staff members dismantling decorations and packing equipment into storage cases. The room looked different now. Less impressive. More honest. Grandeur has a way of fading once the audience leaves. Madison was still working the room. Even at that late hour, she moved confidently from group to group, shaking hands and collecting promises for future meetings. Daniel accompanied her like a trusted partner. Watching them together, I realized something important. Neither of them believed they were doing anything wrong. That was what made the situation so dangerous. People who know they are wrong often hesitate. People who believe they are right rarely do. As I prepared to leave, Grace appeared beside my table one final time. "The board meeting starts at 9 tomorrow morning," she said quietly. "Several members arrived tonight. More will be there by sunrise." I nodded. "Thank you for telling me the truth." She smiled sadly. "Someone had to." We walked toward the hotel lobby together. The elevator ride was silent. Both of us seemed lost in thought. When the doors opened, Grace squeezed my hand gently before heading toward the parking garage. I watched her disappear around a corner and then made my way outside. The cool Boston air felt refreshing after hours beneath artificial lights. My driver had not yet arrived, so I sat alone on a stone bench near the entrance. Traffic moved steadily along the street. Headlights reflected across rain-dark pavement. For the first time all day, I allowed myself to feel tired. Not physically tired, soul tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing how much has changed while you were busy trusting people. I opened the envelope again beneath the glow of a nearby lamp. Henry's handwriting stared back at me from the first page. Strong, steady, certain. I remembered the night we signed those documents. We had been sitting in a small law office after closing hours. The attorney had asked whether we really wanted such unusual protections written into the charter. Henry answered without hesitation. The mission must always matter more than the people running it. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Now I understood. He had never been protecting us. He had been protecting the organization. My phone vibrated softly. A text message appeared from Daniel. "Great event tonight. Looking forward to tomorrow." Nothing else. No mention of seeing me. No mention of the conversation I never knew he had joined. Just a polished sentence that could have been sent to anyone. I stared at the screen for several seconds before locking the phone and placing it back inside my purse. Above me, the city skyline glowed against the night sky. Somewhere inside the hotel, Madison was probably celebrating. Somewhere inside that same building, board members were preparing for an announcement they believed would reshape the future. What none of them realized was that the future they were planning depended entirely upon a document sitting quietly in my lap. And by the time the sun rose, the story they thought they controlled would no longer belong to them. The board meeting began at precisely 9 o'clock the next morning. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive conference room overlooking Boston Harbor. Around the polished table sat men and women who represented decades of experience, millions of dollars in donations, and countless professional accomplishments. Coffee cups rested beside tablets and briefing folders. Conversations were cordial. Smiles were exchanged. To an outsider, it would have looked like an ordinary meeting. I arrived quietly and took my seat near the end of the table. Several people greeted me politely. A few seemed surprised to see me there at all. Madison sat near the front beside Daniel. She looked confident, organized, completely prepared. A large presentation screen displayed the title Strategic Vision Initiative. Everything about the room suggested that important decisions had already been made before anyone arrived. The board chair called the meeting to order. Reports were presented. Financial summaries were reviewed. Committee updates were discussed. For nearly an hour, I listened without interruption. Madison eventually stood and moved toward the screen. Her presentation was impressive. Charts appeared. Growth projections followed. Partnership opportunities were outlined. Several board members nodded approvingly. She spoke with the confidence of someone who believed she had anticipated every question. Then came the proposal. New governance language. Structural modernization. Updated branding authority. Streamlined decision-making processes. The words sounded harmless. Even beneficial. That was the brilliance of it. Complex changes often hide behind simple language. Madison explained each recommendation carefully. By the time she finished, much of the room appeared convinced. This positions us for the future, she concluded. It allows us to grow without being constrained by outdated provisions that no longer reflect the needs of a modern organization. Several people applauded softly. The board chair thanked her and asked whether there were any final comments before the vote. Silence settled over the room. Madison sat down. Daniel glanced around the table with quiet confidence. Then I opened the envelope. The sound of paper sliding across polished wood seemed surprisingly loud. Heads turned. Madison looked toward me for the first time that morning. "I believe there is one document missing from the discussion," I said calmly. The room grew still. I placed the original charter on the table. Then I placed the amendment beside it. Finally, I placed Henry's signed provision on top. Several board members leaned forward immediately. The board attorney adjusted his glasses and stared at the page. Madison's expression changed. Only slightly, but I noticed. "Before any vote takes place," I continued, "I think everyone deserves to understand the complete history of this organization and the responsibilities attached to its founding charter." No one interrupted. No one looked away. The confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier began to shift into something else. Curiosity, concern, uncertainty. The board attorney slowly picked up the document and began reading. As his eyes moved across the page, the color drained from his face. Then he looked directly at me. "I was not aware this provision still existed," he said quietly. I folded my hands and waited. Because at that moment, for the first time since the gala began, the room was finally looking beyond the photograph. The board attorney continued reading in complete silence. No one interrupted him. No one checked a phone. Even the city beyond the conference room windows seemed to disappear. Every eye remained fixed on the document resting in his hands. When he finally looked up, the confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone. "The provision is valid," he said carefully. "It grants permanent oversight authority to Eleanor Whitaker regarding any action that substantially alters the mission, governance structure, or founding principles of the organization." The words settled over the room like a heavy curtain. Several board members exchanged stunned glances. One man reached for a copy of the charter and began turning pages rapidly. Another removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Madison remained perfectly still. Only her tightened jaw revealed what she was thinking. The board chair cleared his throat. "Are you telling us this proposal cannot proceed without Mrs. Whitaker's approval?" "That is exactly what I am saying," the attorney replied. A long silence followed. Then something unexpected happened. One of the senior board members spoke first. "I joined this organization 18 years ago," he said. "I was told the founders built something extraordinary. I am beginning to realize I never learned the full story." Another member nodded. "Neither did I." The conversation shifted. Questions emerged. Real questions. Not about branding. Not about marketing. About history. About purpose. About the people who had built the foundation everyone now stood upon. For the next 20 minutes, documents were reviewed and records examined. Grace quietly provided archived materials. Old photographs appeared. Original meeting minutes surfaced. Donation ledgers were brought up on a screen. One by one, the missing pieces returned to view. There was Henry's signature. There were the early scholarship records. There were the fundraising reports from church basements, community centers, and school cafeterias. There were decades of sacrifices that had somehow been reduced to a few smiling photographs. As the evidence accumulated, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. The organization they thought they understood suddenly looked very different. Finally, the board chair turned toward me. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said softly, "is there anything you would like to say?" I looked around the table. At the board members. At the attorney. At Grace. At Daniel. And finally at Madison. Then I spoke. "For years, I never asked for recognition. Henry never asked for recognition either. We believed the mission mattered more than our names. But there is a difference between humility and erasure." Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. "You can modernize systems," I continued. "You can improve processes. You can create new opportunities. But the moment an organization starts treating its history like an inconvenience, it begins losing its soul." The room remained silent. Not an uncomfortable silence. A thoughtful one. Then I slid the proposal folder back across the table. "I am exercising my authority under the charter," I said calmly. "This proposal is denied." No applause followed. None was needed. Because at that moment, every person in that room finally understood who had been sitting among them all along. And for the first time since the gala began, nobody saw a poster. They saw the person who built the wall behind it.